exploration of curatorial hospitality. On behalf of everyone in the audience, I'm delighted to welcome them today. And so Bojana Videkanić is an art historian and artist born in Bosnia and Herzegovina, former Yugoslavia. After becoming a stateless person, she came to Canada as a government-sponsored refugee in 1995. Videkanić is assistant professor of contemporary art and visual culture in the Department of Fine Arts at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. Her research focuses on 20th century socialist art in Yugoslavia and its contributions to the rise of global modernism through Yugoslavia's participation in the non-aligned movement. Her book, Non-Aligned Modernism, Socialist Post-Colonial Practice in Yugoslavia, 1945 to 1985, was recently published by McGill Queen's University Press, and you can find a link to that in the chat. Videkanić has also written about contemporary artists from the region, most recently about Tanja Ostojić's 7-year project, a lexicon of Tanja Ostojić, sorry for mispronouncing this word, which deals with the recent cultural and socioeconomic histories of post-Yugoslavia region from a feminist perspective. And again, you can find a link to that text in the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Bojana.
Thank you, Sylvie. Thank you so much. And I know that sometimes our Yugoslav last names can be quite long.
Thank you.
But thank you so much for inviting me and for this introduction. I'm going to start sharing my PowerPoint. So just bear with me for a second. And hopefully people can see now. So I'm going to just very briefly try to, in this 15-minute period, introduce some of the ideas that I was trying to work with while I was thinking about hospitality. And Sylvie was so generous to invite me to contribute. Actually, our mutual friend Lala Raščić is on this meeting, and she's an artist who's sort of introduced us, who's also from Bosnia, like myself, and we've known each other for many years, and I just want to give a nod to her. So this work has come out of my book that Sylvie has mentioned, called Non-Aligned Modernism. And it has also come out of my thinking about Yugoslav history and art history in not in a modernist sort of canonical modernist structure, but outside of that. So in a way, what this text that was published in public and what the book are doing is basically intervening into canons of art history, especially modernist art history, that have been dominating the discourse of the discipline for many, many decades, and the ways in which Yugoslav art history has sort of has been framed within that canon. So this is sort of trying to get away outside of that and see what was happening in Yugoslavia in between 1945 and 1985 that's outside in a kind of an alternative modernity. The object of this particular text was Ljubljana Biennale of Graphic Arts, which is one of the longest running biennale exhibitions, post-war biennale exhibitions. It started in 1955, started together with Alexandria Biennale, and started together with Documenta, the famous Documenta, as well as Sao Paulo, that started slightly earlier. So I'm kind of drawing a parallel between all of these places in the world and trying to understand what the role of it was through Biennale's, Ljubljana Biennale's work. So when Sylvie asked me to think about hospitality, I was sort of struck by how to think about it, because I understood that, yes, Ljubljana was about hospitality. I just never thought about it that way. So I had to kind of think about the ways in which this is shown through the curatorial work that was done One of the important things, of course, is that Yugoslavia was a very small country on the outskirts of Europe, in Eastern Europe, in the Balkans. It was a colonized country up to World War II. It was a country that was impoverished and without a large artistic and cultural infrastructure. So when Ljubljana Biennale starts in 1955, it really starts from a very, very small base, both financially and otherwise. And so the people who were involved with it were really important because they were working with relatively small budgets. So what they had, of course, was the famous sort of Balkan hospitality, or what we're often described as, and welcoming the world was something that was emphasized by those who were participating in the Biennale from the very get-go. And in fact, in the first Biennale, in some of the documentation, they talk about the exhibition as a bridge between the worlds, which is the title of my text. And that bridge between the worlds is really in the Cold War environment of post-World War II, where you have the Western and Eastern Bloc and Yugoslavia not belonging to either. The idea was that we invite artists from all of these sort of separate and almost warring sides to participate and to meet. And so the meeting place or the bridge was often a symbol or kind of a metaphor used to describe this exhibition. And that's where I find the hospitality. So this is one of the jury committee work, documentary photograph of the international juries that would be convened every second year to decide on the winners of on the awards of the Graphic Biennale. So right from the get-go, there was a lot of different people who participated, from very young female curators that we see here. They're on a picnic just as the opening of the Biennale started. They were all in their 20s and 30s, and they will become later on in the decades in the 60s and the 70s, some of the most important curators that built Yugoslav modern and contemporary art. And here they're just sort of starting in their work. So the hospitality was always about reciprocity and community, because Yugoslavia, as I said, as a poor country with not a lot of resources, had to sort of play a very kind of pragmatic role. And in order to entice Western big name artists who would bring more prestige to the exhibition, they had to somehow make them want to come to Biennale, and that's what they were trying to always do. On the other hand, they were also very interested in bringing people from, let's say, China, artists from Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, in order to be able to sort of create a kind of a clash of ideas. And many of the people who were collaborating on organization of the Ljubljana Biennale, we're talking about this idea of clashing of the aesthetics. So on the one hand, we have the hospitality and community, drinking and going to studios and traveling through the country. And then on the other hand, there's this idea that, well, let's see what is being produced at any given time when the Biennale is convened, and let's see how these ideas work. So, from the openings, these are all documentary photographs from the Ljubljana Biennale's archives. There was always a lot of drinking, a lot of different kinds of activities that were organized. And in fact, Yugoslav artists who were invited to present at the Biennale were always encouraged to create friends amongst the invited guest artists who were coming in and curators. And in many ways, the exhibition was often described as a place to kind of network in this sort of social way, in a friendly way, and not only in a professional way. So the principles of curatorial hospitality that I outline in the text or that I found are four basically that I talk about. And one is collaborative approach to organization. It was always done through committee work. So there were people who were more famous and more, frontline, but really every time and every year that the Biennale would happen, it was a group of people. It was always committee work that was made up of people from all over Yugoslavia. The second one is hybrid or pragmatic approach to selection of artists. So, for example, when they were invite Western artists, they would just invite particular artists and ask them if they would be willing to come in. But for example, when they were inviting Soviet artists or Chinese artists, they knew that they couldn't extend the invitation directly to them because of censorship. So they would invite the government, the state itself, to choose the artists and then present those artists. Often this created a kind of aesthetic imbalance, and there would be artists who were sort of very, very conservative in some ways, aesthetically conservative, who would be invited and representing their country, and in other ways, there would be artists who never had a chance to be exhibited. So this is really important because in some ways the collaborative nature was in organizing, and then it was sort of relinquishing at certain moments the role and gatekeeping role of the curator that had to be relinquished as well. And number three was the inviting as many artists from all over the world. This was an important point that and I'm going to just skip through a couple of slides. So this was a really, really important point that as the Biennale sort of developed throughout the 70s and 60s, the amount of non-Western artists and artists from all over the world, not just from the centers of artistic power of modernism, grew. So this is my data analysis as an art historian. It's not very sociologically correct or mathematically, but I've tried my best. So basically what I did is I did a series of analyses from different years between Documenta, Ljubljana Biennale, Alexandria, and Sao Paulo, which were all sort of created in the same spirit in post-war modernism. And as you can see, in the first Documenta in 1955, there was 1% of non-Western artists, whereas Ljubljana had 35, Alexandria 60% non-Western artists, and they're marked in blue, and Sao Paulo 47. This changes in 1977. So between Documenta, Ljubljana, and Sao Paulo, Documenta has about 5% of non-Western artists, Ljubljana and Sao Paulo approximately 75 to 77. So this just gives you a kind of a very broad picture of what it meant to welcome the world, right? Not just particular world, but the entire world. And this was really important for what I talk in my book about networking and creating alternative networks of non-Western arts and artists across the world. And so final point of hospitality and curatorial approach is inclusion of different aesthetic approaches. And this is also something that's key. There was, and this is also something that created a kind of a polyvalent or multi-modal approach to understanding contemporary print, because they were not making certain demands, aesthetic demands on artists, but they were inviting everyone who was making graphic arts at the time. So you would encounter anyone from pop art, sort of artists who were working in abstract expressionism, to artists who were social realists in the 1960s and 70s. So this also kind of welcomed different kinds of things. And of course, the curators, the organizers, were actually criticized for this and were called, this was called a problematic approach, because they were this eclecticism was seen as confusing and not really helpful, which of course, from today's perspective, looks very, very different. this inclusiveness looks very different, and which is why I think it's important to talk about it.
Minutes.
Okay, and just to show you a couple of examples before I go, before I'm done. So in the 1960s, especially, what was really important was the representation of the non-aligned artists who were coming from the non-aligned movement, of which Yugoslavia was a member, one of the founding members. So this is an installation, one of the images that I could get to from showing the Bangladesh, Puerto Rico, and Iraq's exhibition in 1977. And then that meant that, of course, when artists were invited, they were coming from those countries. Elizabeth Cutlett was at the Biennale several times, as was Menhat Alahelmi. Of course, Elizabeth Cutlett is coming from Mexico at this point. That was not a non-aligned country, but I think that it was important to have this kind of representation, political representation. And Menhat Alahelmi was a very young Egyptian artist. She was at the Biennale 4 or 5 times. She's won awards. And almost no one talks about her, but thinking about this kind of work is very, very important. And of course, she's Egyptian, so coming from one of the founding member states. And we had people like Rufino Tamayo on one hand, and then Rafa Naziri, Iraqi artist on the other hand. So this shows you a little bit of this eclecticism in approaches. And of course, there were many, many artists coming from Soviet Union, Bulgaria, Poland, and others that were, again, very different aesthetic approaches. So I'm going to end here. I just wanted to kind of outline these 4 points, and I'm going to stop my sharing. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bojana, for the amazing talk. And I'd invite everyone to congratulate her in the chat and begin your questions. I'm delighted now to introduce Shannon Stratton, who will in turn say a few words about living within the play and her collaborators. Shannon Stratton is an independent curator and writer with a background in studio art practice. She co-founded the artist-run organization 3 Walls in Chicago in 2003, where she was artistic director and then executive director until her departure in 2015. She was chief curator at the Museum of Art and Design in New York from 2015 to 2019. And last year, in 2020, she joined Oxbow School of Art and Artists residency as executive director. Her research and work continue to explore the relationship of making and craft to the construction of events, experiences, and social relations. Thanks so much. Welcome, Shannon.
Thanks, Sylvie. Hi, everyone that I can't see. It's a pleasure to be here this evening to have the opportunity to present our project, Living Within the Play. Myself and my collaborators, Kelly Kaczynski, Kelly Lloyd, and Mark Jeffery are joining you this evening. Kelly Kaczynski and Mark Jeffery are in Chicago. Kelly Lloyd might still be in Italy, or she's back in London, and I'm joining from Saugatuck, Michigan. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the project Living Within the Play. Kelly Lloyd's going to put our bios in the chat box, and then we will proceed with a recorded conversation that the 4 of us had in preparation for this evening that has been edited by Kelly Kaczynski. So just as a very brief introduction to the project, I was invited by Michelle Grabner to come and do a project at the Poor Farm probably in 2017. And in 2018, I spent some time at the Poor Farm in Wisconsin for the summer and devised the concept of the Working Group for Unmaking. And the Working Group for Unmaking was sort of just a loose, loose parameters for thinking through the format of using the artist residency site as a basis for critically and creatively exploring the nature of intentional temporary communities in the arts, and a way to develop thematic frameworks, questions, or prompts for groups to work collaboratively over short periods of time. And it was called the Working Group for Unmaking because after a pretty long career in arts administration, founding a nonprofit space, I was really interested in what it might mean to kind of unmake the types of, I suppose, sort of structures that tend to be fairly standard to the operation of a nonprofit art space or an artist-run space, and working through those ideas with a kind of ever-changing group of artists and collaborators. So out of that concept, Living Within the Play emerged, and this is a collaboratively managed project that is led by myself, Kelly Kaczynski, Kelly Lloyd, and Mark Jeffery. And in keeping with the nature of the Poor Farm, Living Within the Play is an experiment in creative production, and it's deliberately speculative and resistant to procedure. And from that point, I'm going to let Kelly Kaczynski share her screen, and our collaborative conversation will explain the rest, and we'll have some text on there as well that give a little bit more background information on the project. At present, we currently have upwards of 30 members that are working with us on Living Within the Play. This group of people will become key holders in the project and develop projects and activations through residency at the Poor Farm this summer. We've introduced them to this idea over 2 dinners on site in the summer of 2019 and a solstice gathering at Mark Jeffery's home in December of 2019. Since then, we've been meeting online in preparation for being able to gather again in person. So I'm going to start off by asking a question that just directly that pertains to the title of the panel that we're a part of. So Kelly Kaczynski, can you respond a little bit to this idea of what curatorial hospitality might be? Could you describe that in your own words, maybe less so than define it?
It's interesting because when we first began in our conversation, Shannon, we weren't talking about hospitality. You and I had talked about really working from a place where there is no envisioned origin, working from a place where the purpose was to be with each other, that there wasn't a preformed or preconceived idea, ways of occupying a space, how to understand a space, either architecturally, responsively, historically, but also ways in which we are with each other in a space and what we're drawing from that. So Living Within a Play for me really began as this way of bringing people in to gather and form thought or form. And from there, in the 4 of us, our conversations got to this place of, as we were inviting people in with the invitational, and we brought ourselves to the idea of the dinner party, where ideas and thoughts and conversations can form almost without purpose while that's happening. And then that turned into conversations of engagements around care, hospitality, radical hospitality, and extending out from there. And so at some point, I believe maybe it was our second dinner party that we had that first summer, where we had a number of people in. One of them was Julia Klein. And I remember at some point you and I were cooking, and you had talked about talking with Julia and how Julia was just so easy to talk with, and how she was so good at just asking questions. And I remember thinking, yes, I know that about Julia. And also I found that about you as being really good at inquiry and asking questions and forming conversations. And this is an art that I'm not very good at. In knowing you, so I also know more about your work and ways that the work prompts conversations. And so I'm interested in your perspective, both around the personable conversation and then extending out from there and how you see that happening.
Yeah, what a huge compliment. I feel like I'm actually terrible at coming up with questions, but I think I'm generally okay at being interested in people. I wonder if questions are just kind of an extension of feeling like it's okay, there's a place for you to actually like dig a bit deeper with other people. Like, I wonder where that comes from exactly. Like, I wonder if that is because you're in a place that is familiar to you, or because you've brought people into that place, or because you know, like maybe I felt okay talking with Julia because I knew that she was, you know, a good friend of yours, Kelly. And so I knew that maybe I could push the boundaries in terms of being, with someone else in a way that's like very honest and open in this kind of exchange of questions and listening. I didn't feel like that was threatened. It's a really interesting question because I just had dinner with two new people earlier on today, and I felt like I asked them the wrong question. Sometimes you do, through this line of questioning, find like this spot that people don't want you to push, but because you've been in this like nice affable thing, you push it because you're like, oh, this is just a great conversation, and then you make people feel vulnerable, you make people feel insecure. And I think sometimes because I've been doing this interview project, and that's a certain kind of space that I invite people into that maybe welcomes this kind of vulnerability in a way where, like, as somebody who also creates public programs, maybe dinner is actually not the space for it. And so it is funny how these skills, I think, can be used in all of these different environments, but the environments themselves are like incredibly different. And people respond to that almost just as much as the questions themselves and who's asking them, and the relationship of the person who's asking them to maybe someone else they know in that situation. I mean, I guess in line with this question of like how you make a space with other people. Mark, I think you're maybe the only person out of all of us who brought a long-term collaborator into the project, as well as like invited people who you may or may not have had like other collaborations with, and I know that you collaborate quite often with people. We just met the other day someone who you're collaborating with who's at the Hubbard Street Dance Studio, in Chicago. Yeah. So I guess I'm wondering about how you navigate different levels of collaboration with people in kind of maybe the same space, like even the same house, in terms of the Poor Farm.
You get rid of them. No. Well, it's interesting that art school education that I came from was always like the individual, right? The individual, you've got to only make work separately. But I think through coming to Chicago in 1996 and then working with this company called Goat Island, that was a methodology that is sort of embodied in me. And that was always a sort of a very diplomatic, very democratic way of working, so that each member had a sort of the same amount of weight as everybody else in the group. So that's always been a very big part of how I make work, but also how I think about collaboration, in the sense of you're bringing people together that shouldn't be together, right? So I think in terms of within the Poor Farm context, again, it's always interesting to me to think about what we all did with our invitations, right? Of bringing people together, guests and strangers, friends, and actually seeing how those things can extend themselves into a further fabric or a further network. And I guess for me, it's just always important to understand other people through making. And in that making, there is always a place of care that comes from that space, so that all I do is all I've ever known is to work. But actually, through that working process, that actually, as sort of four of us have got to know each other. Some people I know better than other people in this room, but like actually, Kelly and Kelly, I've got to know you in a way that I didn't really know before. So again, it's like collaboration helps to create friendships, I think, but also collaboration, I think, again, within the Poor Farm context, actually again creates that sort of horizontal way of thinking, in terms of the fact that you're putting all these different people in a room together that would never be in a room together because of the four of us, and then of course from them, it's again another way for community to come together and for other people to get to know one another in a place of care, right? So that I'm always interested in the dancer getting to know the visual artist getting to know the curator getting to, right, They should never be separate.
No, this Q&A is making me like feel like really happy. Oh, I like this project. It's been a really long year and it's hard to figure out like what
it's like a missing
priorities are in life. And then you listen to people talk about something you're involved in and you're like, yeah, no, I love this thing. This is becoming the slowest art project ever. But like, when you say that like collaboration is how you get to know each other, I was just thinking like, yeah, well, there's not been some like big to do that's happened yet. There's just been this very slow, like getting to know one another that feels like maybe the most valuable thing.
Yep, absolutely.
That's it, you know?
Yeah. Shannon, in relationship to that, maybe talk about some of the gestures or the activities or the kinds of things that did bring people together. I'm just thinking about your beautiful cocktails that you would make. Yeah, just the different kinds of activities of how exchange and relationships were built, actually, I think, in terms of those two dinner sessions.
I think that the things that connected people over this very slow project that we're developing, I mean, obviously for the most part, they were things that happened in person over those two dinners, but I think it's interesting to think about how when we started this project, we had to meet over Zoom before Zoom was a thing that everybody did. And I remember like meeting with you all over Zoom and us having like various like technical problems. Like, and then when we got there, having those Zoom lectures with Annalise and with Sarah, and like us having all these like internet connectivity problems. And it's interesting to think about like what connectivity was to build this thing and then like what connectivity now is to most people. And we were already thinking about like, how could we do this with, you know, because Kelly is in London, but Annalise is in Berlin, and you were thinking about people you wanted to bring into the project that didn't live like within the Midwest. And so before there was truly like like a global experience of like a struggle for connectivity, we were trying to figure that out, like what place and site meant if we were wanting to work with people that weren't necessarily like within a 2-hour drive of that site, which is exciting to think about that now. So anyways, and that is a sort of stretchy answer to what you're asking, Mark, because I think the ways we were thinking, we were trying to connect from the beginning. Like, it's like, how do you connect? And we were trying to figure that out as collaborators that, you know, and then, okay, how do we get people here? Well, we think about our connections that we have with people we've taught with or already collaborated with or have had as students or have shown their work or have, you know, worked with in other ways, or we admire, maybe we haven't actually worked with them yet. And then so that's a kind of connectivity right there. That's like a pre-existing sort of connectivity. And then that's where I think the hospitality really, in the more traditional sense of the word, came into play, is that we were looking for gestures when people arrived that would be like further those sort of opportunities for connection. And obviously food and drink are really important to that, but I think the most lovely thing that happened was this invitation for people to share something, to like share something from their practice that was connected to ideas of neighborliness, hospitality, and care, and just like the beautiful ways that people went about that. Like, I think a lot about Latham giving everybody a piece of that soap. Like, I think about that all the time. Like, and it's funny to think, you know, when you think about like what artworks stay with you in life, and like I think about Latham giving us soap all the time. Like, that wasn't really a performance piece, right? Like, I don't think in that context we're like, this is art, but I think about that all the time as art. Like that choice to bring that thing and that gift as a really kind of profound and like beautiful thing to share with people. So I think about quite a few really like moments of that kind of like giving and reciprocity that happened over those 2 visits as like memorable art experiences in my life.
just to give people a sense of how big this has grown.
Yeah.
And I don't think we need to explicitly talk about it here in terms of the key holder idea, but really that the site itself is housing an amorphous in and out. And that there's, there might be things to look at, but there really might just be experiences to relate.
The way this group of invitations came was about the different ways people in this group thought about like collaboration, space,
Exchange,
play, like hospitality, like those things were all in my head based on the work that you already did. So it was like, here are people who think a lot about assembly. I think there's like an idea that everybody has some different way in their practice that assembly, whether like literally or critically, exists in their work. That there's different perspectives here in a really important way that like can look at this site and look at the idea of bringing people together from like 4 complementary but slightly different angles.
I'm also maybe selfishly thinking about a staging that happened, I think, on the second gathering, where in a very strange way, outside the house of the poor, or outside the front facade of the poor farm. I always think of that as like such a theatrical building in the way it performs itself. So that was sort of favorite moment to just before dinner, I think, as the sun was setting.
To what you reminded me too, Mark, I mean, one of my favorite moments really at dinner was when Li Ming brought out everybody else's face, that we all wore everybody else's face. That was just beautiful.
How is this project curatorial, if it is at all?
I have 2 thoughts. One is I think about this as an invitational, and that brings up this idea of the key holder. So I think about that, but I go back to the curator means care for objects, care for artworks, care for artifacts. If I apply curatorial to this, because I don't feel like a curator at all here, but it really is forms of caring for what others are interested in bringing here.
Caring for other people's ideas, their presence.
And learning from them.
Yeah, learning from them. But learning, to always be open to and continue to learn, I think, is an act of care.
Well, there's always the act of undoing, right? I think about how to undo through getting to know a stranger. So I think about those kinds of relationships that we created. I think of care, all of us, right? We're almost at the year cycle of being alone. And, just thinking about isolation and actually thinking about not only that sense of community building or world building that I think we did in August of 2019, but actually somehow still continuing that, right? So that for me is like a mutual exchange, right? In terms of now, as we do our monthly gatherings online and thinking about how, we're opening up that space for, tarot readings or cooking shows, or asking community to keep making together. Anyway, I just think about that's the sense of care. Is that to be continued?
It's absolutely.
The soap opera
there was about in all of the material we produced, there was approximately 4.5 minutes left for my edited version, which I could have edited way down, but we talked for quite a while. So I hope that we get many more conversation out of this. And I invite everybody, I'm going to put in the chat the Instagram, like a hashtag handle. We have an Instagram. And so I'll put all that stuff in so you can see images associated with some of the things we're talking about.
I think we're probably over. This is good. I think we're over time, right, Carmen?
Hi, everybody. We're real-time Zoom now. I think we've got to go and let the next our next.
I've got to go make some dinner for everybody. I'm going to make dinner for everybody, so just get ready. We'll have some nice Brighton beans for you all. Get ready.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. Now I'd like to welcome Lisa Baldissera. Lisa's worked as an independent curator, consultant, and writer, and in curatorial roles in public art galleries in Western Canada since 1999, including senior curator at Contemporary Calgary from 2014 to 2016, and chief curator at the Mendel Art Gallery in Saskatoon from 2012 to 2014. She was curator of contemporary art at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria in British Columbia from 1999 to 2009, where she produced more than 50 exhibitions of local, Canadian, and international artists. She holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of British Columbia, an MFA in art from the University of Saskatchewan, and is a PhD candidate at Goldsmiths, University of London. She's currently director of Griffin Art Projects in North Vancouver. So welcome, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Sylvie. So I'm just going to share my screen here. So thank you again, Sylvie, so much for putting these panels together. It's just been such an exciting series, and for your vision for this journal. It's really remarkable, and the approaches that everyone has been taking, I've been really enjoying listening to everyone. So my contribution to the journal is a series of fictocritical short stories, and these are experiments that I've been doing over the last couple of years. It's a new form for me, and it's something that I was thinking about as I considered hospitality. These three short fiction works are entitled Weepers, and they really are about looking at curatorial practices and kind of naming and inventing, sort of sidestepping instrumentalized forms of academic writing to posit a kind of dream time or an academic imaginary, and to sort of reinsert that as a place of resistance. And as a way to think through some of the institutional practices that aren't always the topic of the curatorial work, that are happening, there's a kind of marginality around really important thinking around power structures, and the way that power is shared through policies, through non-disclosure agreements, through scheduling, through all the things that are about curatorial work that really are unspoken. So in making these stories, there was something very satisfying about including this kind of embodied practice around curatorial work and acknowledging the kind of inherent vulnerability of this embodied practice, and to show as well how subjects are figured and how subjects are configured by institutional forces. So not only are we writing into and working into structures, we are also formed by them. But I wanted, I'll read just a little bit of an excerpt from the story, and I'll just give you a bit of a preamble to some of the things that have informed the thinking. So just sort of three instances. One was this conference that was produced in Calgary in 2017, Never the Same, What Else Can Art Writing Do? And we really were bringing together, bringing together a series of writers to really think about different forms of writing that had been emerging for a few years at that point. So it wasn't completely new, but there were a lot of experimental practices that it felt like it was time to get together in a very convivial way and unpack together. So it felt very much like a workshop as much as there were presentations and sharing. There was a lot of sharing of writing, and it was a very warm and convivial place to unpack performative writing, fictocriticism, more traditional forms, and just to be together to have that conversation. So the second instance I want to point to is this postcard. Oh, I just want to mention too that that if you do want to see that conference, it actually is online, and there's a website that we'll share if you want to see any of those sessions. So this particular work is actually not intended to be an artwork, and it was part of a project that I did called Person. Leon Coupé is the grandfather of Pierre Coupé, who's actually one of the founders of the Capilano Review and an artist. And he and his family actually retained these love letters that were sent between his grandparents. And they were sent from Paris to London, and they were a series of kind of embroidered postcard conversations. And he would write these love letters over top of found postcards, and sometimes to the point where the postman could barely deliver the work, deliver the piece. And but on the flip side of the postcards were these images of the modernization of Paris. And it was really fascinating. It was the time of Haussmann's modernization, the time that the sanitation was starting to modernize Paris. And it was a really interesting intimacy between these writings and these love letters, and the fact that these subjects were also being formed by these changing systems, these modernities that were coming into being in the form of these institutional and structural supports. So this also was something that I thought about in terms of an earlier project called Convoluted Beauty, which I did in 2014 at the Mendel Art Gallery. And this project was looking at Emily Carr, particularly a period in her life which was really difficult. It was from 1899 to 1904 when she went to the Westminster School of Art, and she wanted to study, and it was a really important time for her, but instead she was hospitalized for 15 months with hysteria, and she was forbidden to work for that period of time. And you can see her on the right at age 30 when this happened to her, and on the left, just an image of the kind of institutional structures that were formulating her life at that time. So this is mealtime and the amount of food, the amount of time that she had to eat it, the amount of work that she could do, which was actually nothing except for what she was allowed to do in this little sketchbook. So this is actually the cover of the sketchbook that she had for that period of time. So forbidden to paint, she actually drew and wrote about this experience of being hospitalized. And I found it really fascinating because in the kind of marginality of these ways of trying to understand and resist this kind of formulation of her subjectivity, she created these stories, you can see these kind of notations for poems. And on the right-hand side, what I think was quite fascinating is the inside cover of the journal, in which you see a series of names that are circled and some of them sort of crossed out. And it was the sanatorium where people were coming and going, some of them passing away from TB and some of them surviving. So this was a incredibly poignant time in her life that she managed to work through with writing. And she had a way of considering how these institutional structures really were formulating and structuring her life and pushing back against some of those pressures. So I began to write a series of short stories. There are 12 of them in a collection called Dead Peasant. And 3 of them, I was very fortunate enough to have Sylvie choose for this publication. And I'm going to just read very briefly from one of the stories. The weeping started at conferences. When asked to speak about my work, my eyes began to water. I thought about the unpaid wages. I thought about the free labor. I thought about what it had been like to be an unfunded doctoral student for 6 years. The terrorization of poverty. 3 people had been killed on the street in front of my student apartment on Hackney Road. The buses had driven around their bodies in large arcs. People were impatient with the obstruction. The dead are a strange and obstinate work crew. They labor silently to tell us what we should prioritize as the living. They remind us that punishment awaits those who get it wrong. You could be dead, they say. You could be dead, so do what's right to stay alive. We don't listen too closely to their admonishments. We know the dead stories are puppet shows we animate, and this is why the dead are so frightening. We feel their longings, the things they left undone and unsaid. We want to believe the dead now understand what it is to be free, but they press at our windows, whispering their regrets. The dead chide us, and we strain to hear their admonishments, that there are some things capitalism cannot extract. We are rushing. We don't have time to sit and wait for the words to become clear. Capitalism is unable to exhume the body's desire, they say, for instance. It's only materiality, something mitochondrial, for example, that they can conjure a patent force, they say. We might ask what they mean by desire then, or what desire might will into being, but who has time to decipher their answers? On my way to Yorkshire to Charlotte Bronte's house to see the long, modest wooden table in the living room in front of the fire, where she and her sisters wrote 3 novels, I had been surprised when my journey was rerouted due to a person on the tracks. a transit euphemism for bodies, for the dead. These bodies embroidered rail lines with their refusals and sadness, their pre-tracked thoughts and gray messages like the ghosts of World War II fighter pilots, young German soldiers who, losing their will to fight, might discharge bombs or bullets along a long country road in Devon. The modern dead are unlike our own. Our dead have failed to stay alive, but theirs are heroes. They marched unflinchingly into their destiny decided by others. They are not entrepreneurs. Their dead still have the capacity to elicit awe. Had the German bombers seen the boy beneath them late for school, the only one on the road? My father had run to the farmer's house for refuge and then resumed his walk to school. A child dodging bullets in 1940 would be given a short reprieve inside the old farmhouse, perhaps a cup of tea, a quick pat on his shoulder before being sent back onto the road to continue his journey. A farmer's wife had been kindly and opened the door to him. She was an anachronistic trauma counselor in disguise as a country wife, with dirt enfolded into the creases of her neck, the cotton at the inside of her elbows wrinkled into an accordion of days. Their shared poverty was enough training. The weeping started at conferences. I had graduated and secured my first position as an academic curator for a small liberal arts college. At our conferences, we talked about art in neoliberal times. In one paper, I described the stool at the gallery where I worked reception for £7.50 an hour. The too tall stool was an expression of repressive design. The dangling compressed my hamstrings and made my back sore at night. I had used the silent time to read. I realized privately that I had not felt tears in those instances. I did not tell them now that it seemed to be the speaking that provoked the crying. After this happened in public a few times, I began to ignore it and continued to read my papers with full eyes without pause or stop. I read on and on. Each time the tears came when I read about the osteoporotic economics of art. This leaching of our bones as art workers and academics, of the supports that are the architecture of our bodies and our lives, comes through many forms of violence. The extended periods of sitting or standing, the regulation of the body down to the second, either as self-regulation toward a desired productivity or as an adaptive behavior driven by the new smart academies that now download data at every gesture and betray us by logging our pauses, our daydreaming, our necessary breathing madness, or the spaces between thinking and action that had, since the Renaissance, been considered a form of productivity. Before this violence, to dream was to deepen knowledge, to know rather than to work without knowing, to know the constellation to which our work and our dreaming belonged. More worrying now, my tears filled with calcium seemed to leach my bones further. I hired a wiper. She was a retired page turner who had once specialized in page turning for French horn players during performances of Wagner's Ring Cycle. She was discreet and deftly wiped my cheeks at regular intervals, pacing the gesture with the turning of a page. She could find no work since the smaller orchestras, having lost their funding, began to shy away from large orchestral works. She liked the modesty of my project. These tears were just enough to keep her in practice. Sometimes she brought pink scented tissues balmed with moisture cream. If she was in a hurry, it might be a small packet sitting on the table in front of the microphone, or perhaps wet wipes, which left my cheeks glistening. She began to carry her cards since people started to ask for her contact information. The crying had become more commonplace at conferences, and it was difficult to find good help. Difficult to find someone who understood the professionalism of invisibility. Several months into this new career, the wiper was asked to give a performance as part of the opening of a conference. She had been asked to attend to the keynote speaker, whose face was magnified on a large video screen, so that the audience could spot the eyes welling the moment just before the spillage, when the wiper's expert hands, brown, veiny, and sensibly unmanicured, would intervene. The piece was later played in slow motion throughout the conference, her hands appearing at regular, mesmerizing intervals. People discussed the flick of her wrist, the strength in her fingers, the quiet sensuality of the gesture. They wondered if the gesture could truly be considered empathic, if she had in fact been paid. What was the relationship between compensation and care? Was there a place for unpaid internships in this new industry of wipers? New conferences were established to discuss these issues. The wipers, now a unionized fleet known for their sensible hands, came to these. The industry flourished and branched out as some came to hold the hands of speakers who were unable to cry, and in some cases also attend to the audience members who were moved by the speakers. Tear capture became another important subspecialty predicted by artist Mika Rottenberg, who became a cult celebrity figure among the wipers. Mika wrote an opera for wipers, which was the first wiper dismissed on grounds that it was a Gesamtkunstwerk, its totalizing facade a form of authoritarianism. The spectacle had overtaken the gesture of care once again, she said. Wiper retreats were held most often in Italy or the south of France, and sometimes in Cyprus, where one could become a citizen simply by buying a house. They formed collectives since their wages remained low because they worked primarily for conference speakers, who were often academics, museum workers, and artists. Their new houses were organized as neo-nunneries with service, meditation, gardening, and collectively undertaken care at the core of convent life. An optional residency master's program was developed, and the original wiper was again invited to offer wisdom, her specialization having evolved into the intuition of the wiper. The industry depended on tears the way pipelines depend on fossil fuels. Renewable industrial wiper practices were discussed, and smaller breakout groups formed to resist weeping as an economic mainstay. This was after Cyprus reported that their industry was single-handedly responsible for a rising percentage of its GNP. The Cypriot economy reported growth in jobs, but it did not report their wages or the number of these low-paid workers required to buoy up the dragnet of its national debt. When I read out my research at the last conference I was at first celebrated, the Adam Smith Institute had published a paper, I said. The oversupply of labor the Institute maintained could potentially bring down labor costs for these jobs even further, I reported. For these were jobs everyone wanted. Pay is determined by how much people want to do a job and have the skills to do it. Working less improves productivity, I argued, and thus 4-day work weeks are more productive. It would be necessary for the government to legislate a universal basic income. Outside the windows of the conference room, the dry hot air was carrying sand from North Africa to Southern Europe, distributing its dust over migrant boats. The breeze that day left us parched. Many of us drank coral and purple-colored juices during breaks, which stained our teeth. The wipers' hands paused after I spoke. Then they arose gracefully in the kind of collective unison the neo-nunneries had engendered and left our stages. We watched them weeping. Our oversupply of tears was the crux of the matter, they told us. If we could just stop weeping, we realized, even for a few days each week, we might save our saviors. Their work would not be so expendable, ubiquitous, and poorly paid. If we could legislate our weeping and recover ourselves, they might reconsider. And so this is how hope returned to us after all. Thank you.
I think we need a few minutes. This was amazing. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
I had questions prepared, but I just, I guess I'd like to open it up to the panel and share questions amongst each other. Well, I can also kind of chime in with, I mean, they seem meaningless right now, so, but I'll still share them and we can try to make something with them. So my first question was, I wanted to hear from each of you, what for you does the concept, or sorry, do the concept or the practice or the metaphor of hospitality bring to curating, understood as a practice and a discourse? So understanding hospitality as either or as all a concept, set of practices, as well as a metaphor, and curating as a practice and a discourse.
I was thinking about it in terms of living within the play because I absolutely loved the project. And I feel a kind of grief that it's been restricted because of COVID and, you know, how you're sort of imagining it now. So I guess in that sense, there's been I wonder if you could comment on that. That's my question to the others in terms of curatorial care and hospitality and this kind of adaptability that we've always had, but now it's just become a bit more extreme and tenuous. And what you're thinking about in terms of the next stages.
Maybe I can comment really quickly about the process of doing this project and continuing forward on this project throughout the pandemic. I mean, I think for me, as someone who creates space for other people as a part of my larger art practice, you know, I think part of that is also creating temporal space. So like the, you know, pandemic presented like a lot of challenging circumstances for all of us. And I think we all needed time. And I think we allowed ourselves that time as well as the participants in the project the time. And I think knowing that it's a long running project allowed us to not have to kind of push forward something that maybe just needed to sit until people were ready again to try again. So
another way I think, and we get to this later on in the video, is when Shannon actually brings up the point that, you know, prior to lockdown with the pandemic, we were fooling around with tech with Zoom. We were really working hard to communicate with each other across regions and across lands to be able to talk about what we were forming. And we were bringing in people who were also across regions and lands. And that actually with the pandemic, oddly enough, it brought the fortune of bringing a particular kind of tech that made it more equitable for access in terms of how we were able to seamlessly communicate with each other. So it definitely elongated the project even more than the project was already long. But it also gave us the opportunity to recognize the conditions of the material platform we were within, which is a remote platform right now. But also, oddly enough, bringing in the discussion about within a material platform of remoteness, we also have a very specific platform of site, which is this building or this land of the Poor Farm.
I guess I'm thinking about hospitality as it's always through the creative, right? It's always through that the stranger is always welcome into a home. I'm thinking about, and people are always like, I'm like Rose Nile and I'm like Betty White in terms of my farm stories. I grew up on a farm, but I think about, you know, my father would always, when my sisters were getting married, that he would actually do the entire catering, and it would be literally like 5 wallpaper tables that were connected across the entire, from the living room all the way through to the kitchen, and it would be a production. As in, you know, buttering baps. What the hell are baps? In Britain, they call baps, but in anyway, sandwiches. Anyway, just basically doing that. But I think about the fact again that what we try and do with hospitality, or what I hope we've done with hospitality, is to also think about giving that permission that actually allows people to do whatever it is that they wish to do, but within a sense of community building. So I think about the guest, the host, the stranger, and how gathering is something that really is a thing that we all obviously miss. So here I have been alone. We've all been alone for the last year, but actually just realizing again the gift of what it is to keep building this project. We have an event on Saturday that Kelly Lloyd has been organizing with another person who's on the call, Jesse Malmed, with all this kind of magic that we're hoping to bring to keep people together. Yeah, sorry.
I would just say, add one more thing to that, which is the entire project wouldn't have happened without Michelle and Brad's hospitality, in that they very generously always invite in other people to explore what the Poor Farm could be, and that's their practice with that space. And so there was an immense amount of generosity and trust when they opened up the possibility of using the Poor Farm. And so I think we try to like continue that. Like there was generosity and trust with them saying, sure, what do you think? What would you do with this? And then us then like inviting in all of the people that we've been having as guests to say, okay, and how would you explore and activate this space? So it feels like this, it feels like passing on this kind of act of generosity and hospitality as like again and again through other people and other artists that get involved.
And if people want to turn on their cameras, it would be great that we all have you join in now.
Yes.
And so that we move into the question period and we can see you. Yay. I guess one question for me throughout this kind of ongoing research on what I call the currencies of hospitality is a theoretical challenge that is posed by the consistent reliance on the home as kind of the site or the kind of primary site of hospitality. So often theorists will somehow fall back to the home as that site. And it's deeply problematic, I think, as a woman, because the home is often the site of extreme violence. It's also deeply problematic because many people for several generations now have been stateless. And so that notion, if unexamined, withdraws the possibility of hospitality for a whole lot of people. And so I think one of the challenges for me anyhow, theoretically, is to decouple hospitality from the home. And so what I thought was interesting in all of your talks is Bojana, for example. I think that you're talking at a moment when Yugoslavia is just coming into being. It doesn't yet have a home. It's more of an improvise and a dream, and it hasn't settled yet in 1955. And so I don't know if that's one way that we could perhaps examine that question. For living within the play, I think what's super interesting is the sort of relay between the Poor Farm itself, historically, and then it's being an artist-run space that is then also inhabited by you. So it's kind of this endless relay of hosting and ghosting in a really interesting way. And Lisa, I really think it's interesting the way in which your work is moving, I would say, away from the traditional homes of hospitality to, away from what we would call the kind of curatorial home to a more kind of fugitive practice through writing and fiction. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on this kind of challenge to free hospitality from the home, which inevitably is linked to violence and also to property and therefore to questions of debt.
Well, if I may sort of address that, I would like to call to the importance of home as someone who's lost my home in the 90s and became sort of stateless and homeless. And in fact, Yugoslavia ended only 45 years after it was constructed, built. And in a way, when I was stateless and sort of couch surfing, home was important because it meant safety. So like being somewhere was important. So I would maybe challenge this idea of hospitality, not as a place, but as a relationship. For example, when I was a refugee in the Balkans, my mom was working at a place, and the woman who worked with her knew that we don't have a house, and she lived in a small apartment, and she invited my mom and I to live with her, even though she didn't know us. So that's a relationship. Like I will never forget this, what she did for us when we didn't have place to live. So I would say that it's a relationship, it's a flexibility. And what I've learned from Ljubljana Biennale, from the non-aligned movement itself, and these kind of relationships that are being built in the time of modernism, was that it was about being flexible. It was about allowing different points of perspective to be represented, which is what Ljubljana was trying to do. Even though people berated them, they didn't keep the quality of arts there. So I think that those are like those kinds of important decisions on the part of the host and the guests, or however you want to name this, being flexible, humane, social, and understanding that people are different, and maybe maybe you don't like something about them, but you have to give them their space, is something that's important. So I would just maybe put it in that perspective.
Well, maybe I'll say something about fugitive practices. It's really interesting because as things become, I think, more crystallized in terms of practices and reputational economies, it becomes, to me, is kind of essential to, which I see everyone actually in this group doing, looking through other ways to respond that aren't exactly unsanctioned, but maybe unexplored. And I thought it was interesting, Sylvie, how you talked about this being sort of beyond an interdisciplinary question in your introduction to the whole book, because those can quickly become crystallized, even as labile as they seem, as labile as that term seems. So, and to try and unpack other forms, but really, really embodying them. So I think one of the things I find really interesting with the fiction writing is that there is an affective quality, and that affect can, on the choice of the kind of poetics of the language. So really paying attention to language in quite a different way than I would if I was writing a curatorial essay or an academic essay. And it's been very joyful, actually. There's been something about that. I know that's like a tremendous term to bring up in this context, right? But to pay attention to language's capacities and become reacquainted with it again, because we are all, there are pressures that, making grant applications and writing these things and doing them in as a curatorial form within a certain framework. So there is something, I think, returning the body to the text, which has been really, I think, satisfying.
And I just wanted to throw in one thing, is that for me, and when I do curatorial work, is not actually about curatorial work, it's about making friends. Mm-hmm. So most of the time I'm working with people who become my friends, and we have friendships for years. And so I actually find it really difficult to work with people who I don't know anything about. So it kind of takes a little bit of time to build that relationship. And I know that I'll be friends with these people who, I worked with for many years. So it's a kind of a build-up relationship. And, there's a lot of professionalism in curatorial practices, right? So like kind of strangers meeting and then going their own ways, which is not very hospitable or friendly, right? So how do we think about these relationships as long-term, let's say 10, 15, 20 years? And what happens when we rethink that in that way? And it brings also accountability to the work that both artists and curators are doing.
I think with my practice, I think very much about spatial temporal situations and conditions. But I've also been thinking recently around a kind of polytemporal, or a way of thinking about time as being fore and aft. And so when we think about developing relationships, we're developing relationships both with historical figures and moments, but also ways in which we're developing relationships with those we're in present with now, and then thinking about futurity. And so in terms of, you know, again, while living within the play, we've had it's not necessarily thinking about us as curators, except sort of thinking about this concern around relationships. It's also thinking concern around relationships for temporality, in terms of how we're moving from particular kinds of past presences, where we're at now and what we are in the future. So I just want to bring up this idea about a kind of polychronological, like a sort of multiplicity about where we are in chronology.
Maybe I think that kind of goes back to this question, Sylvie, that you were talking about in terms of like the place of the home. And yeah, it was living within, I think we asked, did we ask ourselves or like other people that came in, like, what does it mean to be a host in some place that's not your home? But even though we were hosts in a place that was not our home, we were very much in a house. We were like in a very definitive place, which, you know, Michelle Grabner was very generous in terms of giving us like a historical context to the place that I think enriched our experience of it. And I think that kind of goes back to what Kelly Kaczynski was talking about in terms of right, what it means to exist within this house with a history, which was its own character in our project, even though it wasn't necessarily a home, and it certainly wasn't our home.
And we have some beautiful comments, so I'll just share them as we wrap up. So if people in the audience have questions, please share them now. And so Sarah Umles says, very interesting what Sylvie said about striving to separate the notion of hospitality from the home. I run an artist residency out of my home, the Residency Project, which I view as an act of radical hospitality and as an embodied investigation into how, through human interaction and intentional living, we can engage alternative social models, not built upon the tenets of capitalism, or colonialist notions of land ownership. My drive to consciously link hospitality to my home stems from a keen awareness of my privilege and access to more space than literally the neighbors who border the land and house I occupy every day. Thinking more about what Sylvie said though. And then A. Wayseth, and I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. Something beautiful during this time is to witness a kind of domestic space that appears as a shifted tableau or the appearance of a lack of table, but trying to produce might not be able. It may be more about a knowing to make transformation or wait to know it. I do think thankful for models that invite, because so much gallery can feel absence of the life that was made from it. Being open to transformation for maker and viewer seems present, that makes itself at a home. A few comments, thoughts, and thankful for you that I can imagine more from what is heard here.
I'll just on the heels of those two comments, I'll just let people know a little bit about actually like how the living with the play is sort of set up to be elaborated upon. So as you saw in that video, it shows these different email invitations we made, and we invited 2 different dinner parties to come and join us there and stay overnight and explore the space and think about how they might use it. That's what's in the photo essay in public. And then all of those artists were then invited to invite 2 more people to come and explore the ideas of using that space. And just sort of on the heels of that last comment, one of the kind of real crux of the thing is, and why it's called living within the play, is this idea of what happens when you layer this kind of living together and living with the space that you are responding to or working within, and then kind of building off or activating, so that the living and the working and the art are all kind of mashed up together and entangled. And so over the course of us activating that space again, that a larger group of key holders will kind of come and use the space when it's works for them, and bring their guests in and do their work or their residency or produce the work that they're interested in that space. And eventually we'll collect all of that and share that through an invitation to a larger public. But it is this kind of like the title implies, like this sense of like, what does it mean to kind of like live within the making at all times?
I was really excited to see your model. We have a residency at Griffin Art Projects, and residencies, just to think about the open-endedness of the way that you're approaching this. It just really struck me that the fact that you don't have a host, the fact that you're sharing this, and that it's a decentered format, especially because of the ubiquity of residencies. It's almost like, we used to have the debates about biennials and traveling to biennials. Now I feel like the debate could shift to traveling to residencies, because there are ways of creating incredibly rich experiences that are co-created, and that doesn't always get centered in the conversation. So the model, I think, and the model of passing it on to another group. And my understanding is you're not there for that next group, right?
I would just like to also call for more, from this sort of more poignant and maybe poetic and diverse understanding of hospitality, or what it means to curate, to kind of more on the ground, a materialistic view as to the infrastructure. And I think this is also important because the questions around who gets invited, where, who's shown, and how, who can travel, is also, a very poignant question. In terms of my own research on the non-aligned and on Ljubljana Biennale, the reason why it started, because Yugoslav artists were seen as sort of the side attraction, or like not side attraction, but sort of on the margins, on the periphery. As many other artists from non-Western countries, and sort of on the outskirts of the big centers. And what they did, and non-aligned cultural alliances and networks were about, okay, well, they don't want us there, or they don't invite us there, so let's just make our own network. Let's just make our own infrastructure, which is also, I think, important. So when we're thinking about hospitality and alternative ways of understanding, we can think about that as a kind of a larger global network that's alternative to Western canonical modernist ways. More like biologically sort of metaphorical networks, or alternative to galleries, right, or alternative to like contemporary. I think that what you guys are doing is that, right? So how do we think about outside of what is usual to the art world? How are those kinds of infrastructures made? And I think that just on that material, in that material sense.
I mean, I'm what you bring up is this sense of how do we read the work, or what are we seeing, where in a material sense, and the conventions of situations like exhibitions or biennials, is this idea about going to a place. or being able to exist within institution. And I think that one of the things that for me is significant about this project is dismantling, but also remaining within a site. I mean, the Poor Farm is a site, but it's a site which essentially allows for a kind of congregation across region. And again, what we were talking about with the advent of the pandemic and this polytemporal situation, we're now able to produce a gathering at Poor Farm without being there. And yet we really also want to be there. I mean, it's an intensely physical site, Mark and I were out there in October a year ago, and a year and a half ago now, and it started freezing. It was colder in the house than it was outside of the house because there's no heating in the house, in the giant building, as a kind of boarding house that it was historically. And so here we have a site which is becoming a site for congregation without the site. I also think that initially, again, prior to the conversations of the pandemic, I was really interested in ways that we were gathering experience and not necessarily material goods. We weren't gathering the proposals that we asked for, or we had a process that we called one sheets, like submit proposals about how you would want to interact. And the one sheets were anything from hard material interactions to propositions for experiences. And we were looking at a way of utilizing the site as a way of housing anything that could amalgamate what would be documentation to what would be primary work. In other words, how primary artworks might be able to be housed on site, but also be intermixed with documentation that could also be intermixed with how do we understand what primary work is. And so I guess I'm only just sort of responding to your question, Bojana, about material situations. I mean, this is in rural Wisconsin where there is audience, but it's also our audience is expanded to an international experience.
Well, I think we are now 17 minutes beyond, so we should wrap this up. I don't know if anyone in the audience has a final question. And if not, I would say to be continued. This was an amazing conversation. Thank you, everyone, for the wonderful presentation, and people in the audience for your questions and your cheering on the side. Thanks so much.
Sarah, it is being recorded.
Yeah. Okay, and the recording will be available on Public's YouTube channel in a few days. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sylvie.
Thank you, Sylvie, for organizing this, and thank you for my co-panelists.
Thank you. Thank you, Sylvie. Nice to meet you, Lisa. Nice to meet you, Bojana.
Yes.
Nice to meet you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh and Corey.
Yes.
SAIC. Thank you, Michelle Grabner, though she just left, I think. But yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sylvie. What a great
Bye.
gift this evening has been.